Professor will answer viewer questions in the latter half of this 1 hour long class. I request the viewers to please send your questions as and when they arise and not wait for the end of Professor's presentation to submit. The Q&A page can be accessed from the left side of your screens. Professor, may I request you please begin?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. 1 second. I'll move to the presentation. Okay. Let's have the presenter mode.
No, not presenter.
Ah, 1 second. 1 second. Okay, so now can you see my presentation, hopefully? So I'm Yossi Yovel from the School of Zoology and the School of Neuroscience here in Tel Aviv University. And the animal model that I study is bats, and in a few seconds I think you will understand why. So I like to start with this image, and I usually address the question to the audience. In this case it will be a little bit difficult, but maybe you can imagine the answer. The question is, what do you think is the densest, the most dense or the most crowded city in the world? Actually, when I ask this question, often people mention cities in India. Now, the answer is perhaps a little bit surprising because when I think of dense cities, I actually think of this type of cities. Unfortunately, the movie is not running, but you can hear the sound. What you see and what you mostly hear is a colony of thousands of bats, all crowded together. Actually, a colony not far from Tel Aviv University, something like 2 kilometers away from here. And in Central America, you even have colonies with millions of bats. So bats are mammals just like us. They have social communication just like you've heard. And they often live in these very, very dense communities, which is one of the things we try to decipher. Why do they live in these communities? How can they live in such dense populations without any police, without any government? I call my research neuroecology because we try to bring together ideas from neuroscience and ideas from ecology. So here's an example of a neuroecological question. A second ago, you've heard the bat colony, and you've heard a lot of vocalizations. Those vocalizations that you heard are actually the bat's language. Okay, I can use the term language even though it's not very accurate in this talk. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves is whether there is information in these vocalizations. Are they saying something to each other? In order to address this question, we used a very huge database of vocalizations that we created, and then we used machine learning algorithms, just like the ones that are available in your cell phones for example, voice recognition, and we showed that indeed we can extract information from these vocalizations. So we can take a vocalization, and I don't know if you can hear it because it's quite faint, but we can take a vocalization and say, what is the context? Are the bats arguing about food? Are they talking about something else? We also showed that the bats learn their vocalization. So there's a big question in neuroscience, which animals are born with their vocal repertoire and which animals learn their vocalizations from adults, for example. And we showed in a series of experiments that bats have to be exposed to adult vocalizations in order to acquire their adult repertoire. So they depend on some sort of learning in order to develop their, again, language. Of course, one of the most interesting features of bats is their ability to use sound in order to perceive the environment. So what we call echolocation, right? So bats, I'm sure you all know this, but you know the basics. Bats emit sounds. Sounds return from anything, from any object in the environment, and the bat's brain can then take this information and build an image of the world, or that's at least what we think the bat is doing. So let's see a few examples for what bats can do with sound. Okay, so now you can see an insectivorous bat attacking a moth. Most bats actually eat insects. They're also very good for agriculture for that reason. And this is done using sound only. Notice how the bat scoops the prey with its tail membrane, again using sound only in order to detect and localize and classify prey. Some bats eat fish. In this case, you can see a bat extracting a fish out of the water, again using sound only, using sonar or echolocation. Same thing, sonar, echolocation. We call it sonar. When it comes to bats, we call it echolocation. Here's a pollinator bat that drinks nectar out of a cactus in Central America. And this bat also pollinates the cactus while doing this. Okay, so the cactus actually wants the bats to approach it. And this same bat also pollinates the agave plant, which brings you and me tequila. So without this bat, we would not have tequila. In a second, this is one of the most difficult tasks that bats solve, and we are trying to understand how. How can this bat identify or classify the spider versus the leaves, the signal versus the background? What you see now are thousands of bats flying together, something very typical for many bat species. I'll talk about this later. And the question here is, how can they avoid interference? How do they not jam each other with their signals? And finally, a short movie taken in the lab just to remind you that bats are flying mammals. So they're the only mammals that have the capacity of flight. And you can see this bat attacking a small worm, a mealworm, or a larva actually, that we hung for it in the lab. Look how maneuverable this bat is. Notice how maneuverable its wings are, much more maneuverable than any bird that you can think of. Okay, so those are things that bats can do with sound, and now I'll try to explain how do we study this and how do we try to mimic this. So when we go through the process of understanding what bats can do and mimicking them, we usually have 3 stages. The first stage is trying to understand what the bats can do with sound, okay? Because if we don't know that they can do it, how will we be able to do it? The second step is to try to understand how, to get some intuition, how do they actually do this? And the third step is obviously to try to build something that mimics them. So regarding the first question, how do we know what bats do? I'm afraid the movie is not going to play because this is not my computer, but I'll explain how we do this even without the movie. So the image that you see is a classical training apparatus that we use in the lab for bats. So when we ask what a bat can do, we have to train the bat, basically, just like you train a dog, for example. Okay, so what you see is what we call a Y platform. There's a base of the platform, and there are 2 arms, and the bat is placed on the base, and then it receives one stimulus from one side and another stimulus from the other side, and it has to crawl to the side that it thinks is the correct side. What do I mean by correct? So, for example, I can train a bat to distinguish an apple tree from a pear tree using this paradigm. So I can play the echo of an apple tree on one side and the sound of a pear tree on the other side, and I can train the bat to crawl always towards the apple tree. And if the bat can learn to do this, this means that its brain is able to use this information in order to solve the task. Okay? So that's step number 1. We have to understand what the bats can do. Okay? Yeah. The next step is, as I said before, is to understand how they do it. Now, for this purpose, we need to collect echoes. So we need to collect sounds, right? We need to look into the sounds that are produced by the environment, the echoes that return from objects in the environment. So in order to do this, we use different types of robots. Here you can see an arm robot on the right, and you can see a vehicle robot, sorry, on the left. Both of these robots have a mouth. They have a speaker, ultrasonic speaker, mimicking bat echolocation, and they have 2 microphones. Here I'm trying to show with the cursor. They have 2 microphones mimicking the bat's ears. So this allows me now to collect actual echoes from the environment. So what do these echoes look like? What you see in the image in front of you at the moment are spectrograms. So each of these is a spectrogram. It's a single echo. You have frequency on the y-axis, and you have time on the x-axis. And you can see the names. We have 5 different types of plants or species of plants in this image. And you can see a single example of one echo for each of them. The second row is an average of many, many echoes. And immediately you see that there are differences. Okay? So now I want to play back the sound of an apple tree to you. and then I will play the sound of a cornfield, and I want you to try to see if you can tell the difference between the two. So here's an apple tree. Hopefully you could hear it. Maybe I'll try to make it a little bit louder. Let's see if I can. This was the apple tree, okay? And now I'll play the cornfield. Okay, so hopefully you could hear the two. If not, I can do an imitation. So an apple tree is something like something like that, continuous, while a cornfield is segmented. It sounds like choo, 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 something like that. And the reason for this, you can also see this immediately in the images of sound, okay? So here's the apple tree, and here on the right is the cornfield. And the reason for this is that the x-axis, I said the x-axis is time, but the x-axis is actually equivalent to distance, right? The further inside the tree we are, the later the echoes return, and therefore time is translated into distance. And you can see with the corn, look at the corn over here, clearly you can see this structure. And this structure is basically the rows of corn. So corn is usually planted in rows, and we can see the fourth, the second, the third, and even the fourth row of the corn, okay? So we get a lot of information about the structure of the morphology of the object using the echoes. Another point that I want you to notice is that we can see into the plant using sound, okay? So because of the wavelength and the relationship between the wavelength and the object, sound travels into the plant, and we can actually gather information even from behind the first row of corn. So what can we do with this? I gave you some intuition of how we can take echoes, just like a bat, and maybe interpret them, maybe classify them, maybe extract some other types of information. And here's an example of an actual applicative project that we're working on using such sounds. So it has to do with precision agriculture, a very big task, especially in India, by the way. I'm in contact with many people in India about this task. And specifically here, we looked at a yield estimation, okay? So a farmer enters, for example, a pepper greenhouse in this case, and he wants to know, or she wants to know, how many peppers, how many kilos of peppers am I going to have at the end of the season? And at the moment, this is a task that is very difficult to solve. אתה יכול להביא לי מים? רציתי לקחת. Sorry. Okay, let's see if I can continue before the water arrives. So, so this is a task that is difficult to solve for the following reasons. You can look at the image in front of you, and you can see that the peppers are green, the leaves are green, the peppers are often embedded inside the leaves. So with vision, for example, it is very difficult to solve this, this task. Okay, so what we did is to use sonar in order to solve the task. I'm not going to go into all of the details. Basically, we use machine learning, which is today used everywhere. We train a classifier on known data. So we provide echoes where the amount of fruit is known, and we train a classifier, and you can see here on the right, you can see the predicted fruit weight. So we're looking at the peppers. You can see the predicted fruit weight on the x-axis and the actual fruit weight on the y-axis. And you can see that our classifier is doing pretty well. So we can say with an accuracy of several grams, something like 10 to 100 gram error, how much fruit is there on a given plant. And this is, again, thanks to the fact that, that sonar provides us information about the morphology of the plant, and thanks to the fact that we can see into the plant. What else can we do with sound? So here's a project, a less applicative at the moment, a more basic science project in which we try to actually build a bat. So you will see a vehicle. Okay, here on the left, you can see the vehicle moving through the environment for the first time. It's never been there. It's not a flying bat. It's a driving bat at the moment. And this vehicle, just like I showed you before, has a speaker in front of it and two microphones. So it collects echoes from the environment. You can see the echoes here in the center. So it has a left ear and a right ear. And the echoes arrive, and everything is autonomous. So there's a computer on the speaker and on the vehicle, and the computer analyzes the signals arriving and builds a map of the environment, like you see at the moment in front of you. So this is a map built based on echoes only, so an acoustic map only. And at the third step, you will see how the vehicle can also make decisions. So imagine a situation, you can see the vehicle arriving at a dead end. There's something blocking it on the right, something blocking it in front of it, and on the left, there is a plant. So what it is now doing is to collect echoes from all three directions and to make a decision autonomously. Everything is done on the computer itself, on the vehicle itself. We have no control, and you can see that it decides that it has to turn to the left and try to pass through the plant. And in a second, it will also succeed. Okay, so this is a project in which we show that we can map the environment using sound only. In the future, in the near future, hopefully, we would like to place our system on a drone. We're actually already doing this in order to perform everything that I've just shown you, but this time from above. This could be extremely relevant for big fields, for example, in agriculture. And we also plan to use additional features, bat-like features like these ears that are very helpful for different tasks that I will not elaborate on at the moment. So I want to go back to bats. I talked a little bit about robots, and in the rest of my talk, I want to go back to bats and try to explain what are the most fundamental tasks that we are dealing with and how we think about these tasks. So I've already mentioned that bats can fly in big swarms of thousands, sometimes even dozens of thousands of bats. We've seen this in the movie. And one of the main questions is how do they avoid interfering with each other? And this is a question we've worked on quite a bit. But I actually want to talk about a different aspect of this behavior. And this is, what are the bats benefiting from this behavior? Are they benefiting from moving in a group? Maybe they're just interfering with each other. Okay? So what's the purpose of this behavior? Now, in order to study this behavior in the wild, okay, where the bats actually behave and not in the lab, we had to develop miniature sensors that can be placed on the bats. Okay, so bats are extremely small. Most bat species weigh less than 50 grams. On the left here, and at the bottom of the screen, you can see the smallest bat and probably the smallest mammal on Earth, bumblebee bat, which weighs less than 2 grams. You can see the size of it. It's an adult. So because of this difficulty, we had to develop our own sensors. We call them the Vespers. You can see an example here. It's a sensor that weighs less than 2 grams. It has a GPS on board. It has a microphone, which is extremely important for us. And it has additional sensors. So it has an accelerometer. You can also record, for example, body temperature. You can perform ECG recording. So you can use the sensor for many, many different recordings. And one of the first, maybe I show you the map even though the movie is not playing. One of the first places we took this device to is Baja California. Okay, so you probably recognize the map. This is Baja California, Mexico on the right side. And here in the center, we have the Sea of Cortez. And in this sea, we have small islands where fishing bats live. So these bats live on the islands, and they go out at sea. You can see this in the next image. This is our GPS data. You can see an individual leaving the island and flying far, sometimes dozens of kilometers offshore, in order to forage at sea and then come back at the end of the night. And we were intrigued by this system because it is extremely difficult to search such a sea. Okay? The bats do not know. They search for fish. They don't know where will they find fish. And they have to search this huge environment, while each of them has a very limited sensing range. So each of them can only sense maybe a few meters ahead, and still they have to search this area of many, many kilometers. So we were guessing, and indeed we showed that this is true, that the bats are actually searching in a group. In order to solve the problem, they are searching in a group. We use our microphones on board the bats in order to assess whether they are in a group. So when I have a microphone on the bat, you can see this over here, okay? I record that these are echolocation calls emitted by the bat. Again, we're looking at frequency over time, spectrogram just like before. We have the calls, these are the calls that I'm pointing to that were emitted by the bat itself. And circled in red, you can see calls of a nearby bat, another bat. So this proves that the bats are actually moving in a group when I see these other nearby bats. And what we show, let's see. Yeah, so unfortunately you cannot see the movie, but what we show is that the bats are constantly moving in groups. So when they leave their island, they're always part of the group, and this helps them to improve searching. How do they do this? This is why I have a bag of chips on this slide. We call it the bag of chips effect. So when they spread, they of course increase the area that they are searching in. But once one individual finds prey, fish in this case, it emits echolocation sounds in a rate that constantly increases. Okay? And while it is doing this, the other bats around it realize that this bat found food. So there is indirect communication within this group of bats. And of course, the next step is to think of a group of robots that perform according to the same algorithm. So this is exactly what we're trying to do these days. We're trying to mimic this type of group behavior that has very limited communication and still allows the animal to search much more efficiently than if they were moving in as singles. Okay, so the next challenge that we're facing, so I talked about working in a group. Another big challenge that bats are facing is navigation. Many bats navigate over dozens of kilometers every night, even more than that. In a second, I'll show you a bat that does even more than that. So this nectar feeding bat that you see in the image, it's the same bat that we saw in the movie before. It's a bat that lives in southern USA, Arizona area, and also northern Mexico. And it's a bat that drinks nectar out of cacti or other flowers. And we've found in a study, again using these GPS devices, that these bats can sometimes fly 100 kilometers one way to a cactus or to a field of cacti and then return. So in total, this small bat that weighs no more than 20 grams can fly up to 300 kilometers per night. Okay, so what you see in the image in front of you is the colony. Each color is a different bat, and some of them, notice how some of them cross the border with the US on a nightly basis, and some of them, like this individual over here, flies over 100 kilometers in order to feed and then return to its colony. Okay, so how do they navigate over such huge distances? It's probably not related to echolocation because they fly high. They fly over 100 meters when they do this, while echolocation range is much, much shorter, probably dozens of meters at most. And in order to study this, what we are doing is to use drones in order to collect the data that would be available to the bat. So we are assuming, hypothesizing maybe I should say, that bats use vision in order to do this. And in order to study their behavior, we take a drone, we fly it in the exact same trajectory flown by the bat, we collect the visual information that should have been available to the bat, and then we throw this data into a neural network, an artificial neural network, and try to understand whether it is possible to train a network to perform this navigation. So can you explain the bat's navigation with this visual input using a neural network? Okay, so this is what we are working on these days. Now, many bats roost, I showed you at the beginning, you remember, in a colony with many, many individuals inside. And then they fly out nightly, come back, interact with individuals, fly out nightly, and come back, interact with individuals. And one of the main questions that we are interested in, so I mentioned already two big questions. How do they act in a group outside? How do they navigate? And now I want to mention a third question, which is what is happening in the colony? So is information being transferred in the colony that is related then to navigation? Did that bat that flew 100 kilometers know something about other bats in the colony? The problem is that in order to follow the bats in the colony, you need to have, I don't know, thousands of GPS devices, for example. It's very, very difficult to do so, especially it is difficult to do so because the colonies are so crowded. So what we've decided to do is to establish our own colony. Okay, here in Tel Aviv University, we have a colony of fruit bats, by the way, a species that is very similar to a bat that you have in India, and it's called the Egyptian fruit bat. And the colony is on campus, which allows us very easy access to the colony. So we can enter the colony on a daily basis, catch the bats, place GPS devices, remove them, charge batteries, whatever we want to do. The bats are free. They go out, they come back, they do whatever they want. So in this image here, you can see an example. Our colony is down here. You can see an example of one bat flying out of the colony. Okay, each night has a different color. Look at this green night. On the green night, she flies out. She moves to a different colony. This is not our colony. She roosts somewhere not far from here. And then on the next night, on the red night, she comes back and roosts in our colony. So there's exchange of bats from our colony and other colonies around. They are interacting with each other, which is a good thing. It means that our colony is now natural, I would say, or wild, so to say. And this system now allows us to track bats over months, okay, something we could not do before. So you can see here, for example, this map shows the movement of one individual along 3 months, the same individual from the first day it was outside. So this is a pup, a young bat. From the first day it was outside and until the age of 3 months, we were able to track this individual, which now allows us to ask a whole new range of questions, okay? So how does it learn to navigate? What do the interactions inside the colony mean for this bat? And so on and so forth. And one of the things that we found, and this will be the last story that I tell you, is related to bat conservation. Okay, so most of my talk had to do with what can we learn with bats and how can we then translate this into robotics or algorithms. And I also want to say a few words about bat conservation. So there are 1,300 species of bats, more or less, known in the world. Many of them are not in a good situation. Many of them, of course, are threatened by human activity, by building of cities, for example, by urbanization, which is a huge phenomena, especially also relevant for India. And what we found, so some bats roost in the city. Okay, maybe you're familiar with such bats in your area. Some bats, most bats, leave the cities. They move out and they prefer not to roost in the cities. But some bats actually roost in the cities. Fruit bats, Egyptian fruit bats, the same bats that I mentioned earlier on, are city dwellers. You can find colonies of bats in the city and colonies of bats outside the city. But what we found is that the movement of these bats is very, very different. So what we call city experts move very, very different from urban experts. Okay, so you can see two examples here on the slide. Up here you can see a country bat. Okay, this is a rural bat. And you can see multiple nights of the same bat. And what you can see is that this bat flies about 30 kilometers every night, 30 kilometers to the same destination and back. So very, if you wish, a very boring bat. Goes out, comes back, goes out, comes back. When you look at the city bat, you see a completely different behavior. Look down here. Again, one individual every night has a different color. And you can see that the bat is hopping between sites. So it's a much more flexible bat, much more diverse in its behavior, moving from one side to another on the same night. And this is something we see now repeatedly in urban bats versus country or rural bats. We're now looking into the basis of this difference. So is it genetic? Do these bats differ in their genes? Do different populations occupy, inhabit the city or the country? What is driving these differences? And what are the differences in the brains of these animals? So there are many studies that show that life experience can change your brain. There is one very famous study done in the 90s on taxi drivers in London that shows that the hippocampus, the area in the brain that is in charge of navigation in taxi drivers in London, is larger on average than that of others. And the more time you spend as a taxi driver, the larger your hippocampus is. Of course, we don't know if this is a correlation or a causation. Okay, let's be careful. But at least this has been described. So we're now doing a similar thing with the bats. We're MRI scanning the bats. I remind you, MRI is a non-invasive technique, so we can scan the bats and then release them back outside in nature. So we are MRI scanning the bats, looking at differences between country bats and rural bats, country bats and city bats. And indeed, we find differences in areas such as the hippocampus, areas that are related to navigation, and also areas, parts of the limbic system, areas that are related, for example, to fear, to boldness, to other characteristics like this. I want to end with a story. I want to go back and end with a story that is not bat related. Okay? So our work on sounds and on the sounds of nature brought us to work on the sounds produced by other animals as well. And in collaboration with Professor Lila Hadani and Professor Yuval Sapir here from Tel Aviv University, we started working on plant acoustics. So again, no bats involved in this story. The question is whether plants can receive sound. Can they use sound somehow? Okay, it's a big question. It's been around for many years. And what we showed in this study is that if you take the evening primrose, this flower that you see in front of you, and you play the sounds of a pollinator, the plant, the flower, will increase sugar concentration in its nectar within a few minutes. Okay, so what are pollinator sounds? So these plants are pollinated by moths, by bees, and when these insects fly over or near the plant, the flower, due to their wings, they emit sounds around 100 to 200 hertz. Okay, this buzz that you know, something like zzz, something like this. And if you take a speaker, that's what we show, and you play back these sounds to the plants, within 3 minutes, they will increase the nectar concentration of their, the sugar concentration of the nectar, probably in order to reward potential pollinators, and in order to to attract then more pollinators later on. So we are now also strongly engaged in several projects that have to do with what I call phytoacoustics, so the acoustics of plants. So that's it for today. I want to thank a lot of students who contributed to this work, including students from biology. So my lab is extremely diverse. We have students who are biologists, we have students who are computer scientists, engineers, and all have to collaborate together in order to do the science that I've shown you today. Thank you very much. We have time for questions. What do we do now?
Thanks, Professor. May I request the viewers if there are any questions?
How will I see the question?
Portal on the left side of your screen and submit the questions for the professor.
Okay, so let's see if I can see the screen. Ah, so you will read them to me? Ah, so you will read the questions?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I cannot hear you. Are you reading it? I can see your lips moving, but I cannot hear you. Ah.
So we've got some questions.
Okay.
The first one is exactly what specifically interested you in looking at bats for your study?
Okay, so I started as a physicist. I did my undergrad studies in physics and biology, and I was looking for an animal that combines the two. And then I was exposed to the use of bats, or the use of sound by bats, echolocation, what I've talked about earlier. And this just fascinated me. So the fact that animals can use this additional sensory system, which we do not have, the fact that they can use the physics of sound in order to perceive the world, that's what mostly drove me into working on bats.
Commercialize the applications for knowing the quantity of produce in agriculture? Is it open source AI or machine learning or proprietary tech? Can you point the viewers to the work?
Mm-hmm.
If there is any?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely we can and want to commercialize it. We are currently negotiating some options with a company that expertises on tomato. So we're trying to do yield assessment of tomatoes in the field. And yeah, I didn't go into the details. I think the AI is very basic. So the question was whether it was open source. So the AI itself is open source. There's nothing special about the AI. What is special, what we know how to do, which most others don't, has to do with the acquisition and with the pre-processing. Okay, so there is currently no device. It's not like a camera, right, that you just buy and deploy. There is no sonar device that you can easily buy and deploy. So that's something that we do. Build it, improve it, use multiple microphones. Those are things that we do that are part of the process. And there is the pre-processing that also has a lot of know-how. So what exactly, which features do you use in order to train your network and then later on test it, okay? So that's a major question, which will be hard for me to go into details, but that's always the difficult question, right? Even when you use images, the question is usually the features, the feature extraction, and not which classifier eventually you use. Next question.
All right, sir. Another question is, do you see any other applications for echolocation?
So I showed you the robot that can navigate using sound. And I always argue, you know, currently robotic navigation doesn't use sound. It uses mostly vision or LIDAR these days, LiDAR, so laser basically. Sometimes they use some sorts of radar also. And I think that sound could be an additional sensor. So it's not instead of vision. We know vision is great, right? But sound gives you some advantages. It allows you to work at night, for example, or when there is dust. It allows you to range, to measure distances very, very accurately. And the data that you acquire is reduced in comparison to vision. So vision is, right, huge data. It creates a lot of data, while with sound you can settle for much less data. So I think that robotic navigation could benefit from adding sonar to the current existing sensors. Any other questions?
Just one more, sir. A viewer is asking if they can contribute to this field when they belong from the field of ecology.
So can you repeat? So can you contribute if you come from a background of ecology? That was the question?
Ecology, yes.
Yeah, so I think I presented maybe, I don't know, 40% of the talk had to do with ecology, with ecological questions actually. So I think definitely, you know, there's the question of conservation that I mentioned at the end. We need to know what the animals need. So, you know, I showed you how animals in the city move differently from animals in the country, right, side, but now we have to translate this into action, right? So try to understand what exactly are the needs of the animal in order to then advise decision makers. Many of the questions that I presented, group working in a group, what is the importance of the colony for information transfer, navigation, these are all questions that are related to the ecology of the bat, and just after we understand them, then we can think of how to mimic and apply them. So the answer is definitely yes.
Thank you so much, Professor. That's all the questions that we have.
Okay.
Thank you to the viewers for joining us. Thank you to Professor for the wonderful presentation. Have a good day, everyone.